The year is 1726, and you are a London tradesman. Your business is good, your children are thriving, and your house is open to friends. One afternoon, you meet your friend Lord Fanny for drinks, and he asks you to lend him a few pounds to cover a pressing bill. Because you trust him and because you have a bit of spare cash, you do. But 2 months later, when Fanny returns to repay the loan, he tells you that his estate has gone bankrupt and he has no way to repay you. Not wanting to make a fuss, you accept a promissory note and let him off. For now, 4 months later though, Fanny is still unable to repay you, and now whispers are circulating that he may not ever be able to. You know that Fanny is a man of means, but will he ever use those means to repay you? If he doesn't, you face ruin. What do you do? If you were a tradesman in early 18th century England, there was only one answer to your dilemma. You sued Fanny in the Court of King's Bench, where a judge swiftly granted a writ of fieri facias, meaning let it be done, which authorized the bailiff to seize any of Fanny's property to pay your debt. And within hours, the bailiff was dragging Fanny to the nearest prison to serve his sentence. You got your money, but Fanny faced 5 years in debtor's prison without hope of parole. Whether or not Fanny could pay you back did not matter. In early 18th century England, the law offered no distinction between intentional and accidental debt. Trade was essential to the English economy, but so was lending money, and that meant that lawsuits over debt were constant. As a result, England's prisons, including the infamous Fleet Marshalsea and King's Bench prisons in London, were filled with men like Fanny, incarcerated not because they were presumed guilty of wrongdoing, but solely because they could not repay their loans. That might sound unimaginable to us today, but for much of the last 400 years, owing money was just such a serious offense that you could end up behind bars for it, sometimes for years. And yet in the early 18th century, these debtor prisons inspired one of the first major campaigns for prison reform, thanks to a group of English aristocrats and reformers known as the worthy poor. The term worthy poor refers to a class of English beggars, paupers, and prisoners who were generally seen as honest, but unlucky innocent victims of circumstance rather than malicious individuals looking to get something for nothing. In other words, people who found themselves imprisoned for debt because of bad luck or exploitation, not because they were trying to scam someone out of money. And the term captures the essence of the English debtors movement, a campaign that sought to separate the unfortunate but honest from those who genuinely deserved punishment. As far as we can tell, the term worthy poor was coined by English cleric and philosopher John Wesley, founder of Methodism. Like many of his contemporaries, Wesley believed that society should take care of those who found themselves down on their luck, but only if they were deserving of help. So who qualified as a member of the worthy poor? Well, broadly speaking, the category included individuals who were neither vicious nor idle. There were people who could not work, such as the elderly or disabled, those who had been temporarily unlucky, such as Fanny and his fellow tradesmen, and groups facing systematic disadvantage, such as young women accused of prostitution or former servants who could not find new positions. This approach allowed the English debtors to frame their campaign for reform in carefully neutral terms, stressing their commitment to helping the truly needy while avoiding the controversial topic of poverty more broadly. Of course, in practice, applying the worthy poor label to anyone involved in the English debtors movement was inherently political and relied heavily on stereotypes and personal biases. Nonetheless, the concept proved incredibly useful in galvanizing support for the cause, especially among religious leaders and philanthropists. Indeed, the notion of the worthy poor continues to shape debates about welfare and entitlement today. When it comes to how many people qualified as worthy poor in early 18th century England, that's harder to say. Estimates vary wildly based on who you ask, ranging from 20% to 90% of the population. However, we do know that the English debtors considered poverty itself a sign of moral worthiness. That is to say, if you couldn't afford to pay your debts, then you probably deserved sympathy, not punishment. Take, for example, the case of Mary Tofts, a young mother imprisoned for debt in the 1720s. Mary owed her arrest to her ex-husband Thomas, who after being sentenced to prison for assault used Mary as collateral. When she couldn't pay his debt, the prison wardens took her instead. She spent 3 weeks in Marshalsea prison before her brother paid her debt and released her. Her story is tragic. but hardly unusual. Across England, there were thousands of families locked together in Marshalsea and other debtor prisons, sometimes for years at a time. In fact, entire communities of prisoners developed inside these jails, with children born and raised in their cells and schools established to educate their offspring. As the son of an aristocrat, James Oglethorpe had never suffered want in his life. Nevertheless, he dedicated himself to the English debtors movement after seeing the plight of his close friend, Robert Castell, who died of smallpox in Fleet Prison in 1728. After hearing reports of corruption and cruel treatment of debtors from fellow MPs, Oglethorpe decided to investigate for himself. He and 2 fellow MPs visited 6 of London's most notorious prisons, meeting with prisoners and administrators to hear their side of the story. What they found was shocking. The prisons were filthy and dangerous, filled with disease and despair. Guards routinely abused their authority, charging exorbitant fees for basic services, and in some cases holding prisoners hostage until their families paid up. What's more, he discovered that many of these prisoners were not hardened criminals, but ordinary citizens who had simply fallen on hard times. Their crimes were not malicious, but desperate attempts to survive. This experience prompted Oglethorpe to launch a parliamentary inquiry into the state of English prisons, which resulted in the publication of 2 reports detailing the horrors of debtor imprisonment. These reports sparked public outrage and led to the eventual release of thousands of prisoners. But Oglethorpe was not satisfied with this modest victory. He wanted to do more to help the worthy poor. So he turned his attention to America. In 1732, he helped found the colony of Georgia as a place where the worthy poor could start new lives free from the stigma and constraints of English society. The colony was intended as an experiment in philanthropy and social reform, offering prisoners a second chance at life outside the rigid confines of early 18th century England. However, this experiment was not without its flaws. Many of the settlers were ill-equipped for life in the New World, and the colony's idealistic vision of communal living and economic equality proved difficult to maintain. Additionally, the ban on slavery, intended to ensure equality for all settlers, ultimately deprived them of the labor necessary to develop the colony's economy. Despite its shortcomings, Georgia offered a glimpse of a different way of thinking about punishment and redemption. By the 18th century, the link between poverty and crime had become increasingly clear. People experiencing poverty were not only committing crimes, but were also disproportionately the victims of crime. To many reformers like Oglethorpe, this suggested that poverty was not merely a matter of individual misfortune, but a societal failure. By the middle of the century, English thinkers were beginning to argue that addressing poverty and inequality was not just a moral imperative, but also a practical strategy for preventing crime and maintaining social order. This,